All right, so we're going to start off with frozen time. I'll probably do two critiques for each section, frozen, extrusive, and still. So for frozen time, we're looking for images that have a clear before and after. We're seeing like a slice in time. And this is always going to have a fast shutter speed. So I'll look at that for all of these frozen time images. And for these first two, we'll look at active and passive framing. So this first image that we have is by Jonah. He's at ISO 100, 114 millimeters, f4 at 1/800th of a second. So really fast shutter speed. You can see that it's frozen time because I think this is his daughter, is throwing this water at the child over here, his son, and we can see it as it's spilling. We know that there's a before, this was all the water was in the bowl, and there's an after as it moves forward towards the other child, right? We also have a before and after with this cute little expression that this kid has, right? As he's looking and then squinting his eyes, waiting for the water to hit him. He's running, he's mid-step. This is all going to change in the next instant. So by shooting it at 1/800th of a second, he's able to show us this frozen time. So the exposure looks great on here. You have good focus on your son. Your daughter is out of focus because you chose a wide aperture. The composition here is really tight. You're really close on the top of the head. Normally, if this was a still image, I would say that that's too tight. But here, it doesn't really bother me because we're seeing so much action happening. Even with the feet at the bottom here, that's not so bothersome. Now, this is more active framing. So we feel like everything is contained within this frame. Everything is beginning with the frame and moving inwards. The frame is containing this whole image. So this is a great example of active framing. This, on the other hand, is more passive framing. The image starts with the cards as they're flying forward, and we feel like it could keep going on beyond the frame. It begins in the center and works its way out and could go beyond. So that's how we're going to see active and passive framing. So this image is by James. You're at ISO 3200, so pretty high there. 34 millimeters, pretty wide angle. F5.6 at 1/800th of a second. So the same exposure as what we had here as far as the shutter speed goes. And that's allowing us to see a before and after. These cards we know are not going to stay in the air, and we know they didn't start in the air. So we imagine a second before as they're being flung up and the second after as they're falling down. So this is a good example of frozen time. Your exposure looks good here. If you could open up the window more, get a little bit more light in, that would be ideal. So you could have a aperture that, or an ISO that was lower. You could also open up your aperture a little bit more just so that you don't have to have it quite so high. So even opening it from f5.6 to f4 would allow you to have an ISO of 1600, which would be a little bit more forgiving. If we look close, you can see that digital noise, how you have kind of speckles of green and red on your image here. That's what we refer to as digital noise. All right, this next image that we have is by Alejandro. He's at ISO 800, 28 millimeters, f5 at 1/1000th of a second. So again, we're seeing a really fast shutter speed in order to freeze the water, or the air, I guess, rather, as it's bubbling up. We see the water moving down as the bananas have been thrown in, and we know it's going to rise back up, and we know all these bubbles are going to go to the top, and the bananas are going to fall down. So we know we're getting a slice of time here. You're nice and sharp as far as your focus goes. The exposure looks good. It's pretty blue. You're underwater, so that's going to add to that. You're having the blue of the tile around reflected on the water, so that's adding to the blue. But you can see that these bananas are pretty blue there, so the white balance is a little bit off. And if you were going to move forward with this image, like to print it or something, I would probably, let's see, I would change your white balance. I'm curious if you set a white balance here. White balance is on auto, yeah. So you could do a custom white balance for this if you have like a plastic bag that you could put your gray card in, or you could just adjust that in post-processing. All right, and this is our last really solid example of frozen time. This image is by Christopher. You're at ISO 100, 70 millimeters, f5.6 at 1/640th of a second. So we see there's a wide range of ISO. So we're at 100, 800, 3200, 100. So a lot of play there with the ISO. The main goal is that our ISO is high enough that we can have a fast shutter speed, and that's what we have here. So the shutter speed's nice and high, and then we see the skateboard as it's mid-air. We know that he can't stay here, but his next movement will put his foot down and the skateboard will come down and he won't be holding his hands up anymore. So we're expecting the next moment. So again, this is a great example of frozen time. Good exposure overall. Let's see if that pants get blown out or anything. Nope, it looks like you hold on to detail. This is more passive framing. The frame isn't holding everything in. We feel like you can move on beyond the frame in a second. And it's not this like perfectly composed image where the frame is controlling the composition, right? It feels very free right now. So that's more passive framing.